I left my husband to care for my dying ex. What happened next shocked me. I left my husband to go care for my ex who was going through a terminal illness. 3 years later, he passed away. I returned to my husband's house, but he no longer wanted to accept me just because I got pregnant by my ex. The day I sat in front of the judge, with my son on my lap and everyone looking at me as if I were some kind of fraud, I heard for the first time out loud that the man I cared for until he died couldn't even have been my child's father. I felt the floor disappear beneath my feet as Javier's family lawyer spoke about sterility, dates, and lies, as if I were a clinical case and not a woman who left everything for love. If you want to understand how I ended up becoming that caricature, you need to go back to when I still believed the world owed me something for everything I was sacrificing. When I left the house I shared with Rodrigo, I felt more relief than fear. Behind me were his annoying silences, his mother's disapproving looks every time I mentioned Javier, and that constant feeling that I had to ask permission to feel. Rodrigo was always proper, organized, stable, but he never understood that a person doesn't just turn themselves off from one day to the next just because they got married. Javier had been my first great love, the one who taught me to live alone, to pay bills, to dream about children. When he called that night, his voice broken saying he had advanced cancer, something inside me ignited. I felt that if I didn't go to him, I would be haunted by the idea of having let him pass away alone. I remember Rodrigo's face when I told him. He said he was sorry, that we could support Javier from afar, help with medicines, contribute some money if necessary. I listened to him talk about boundaries, about respect for marriage, about taking care of our relationship, and all I saw was selfishness disguised as maturity. I told him I couldn't just stand by knowing that Javier needed me, that it wasn't about romance, but about humanity. He replied that I was his wife, not a former boyfriend's nurse, and that I was crossing a line. There was a long argument, full of reproaches from him and tears from my side, until I understood that he would never see it the way I did. So I did what I had to do. I packed my clothes in the big suitcase, the same one we used for our honeymoon trip, and left the keys on the dining room table. Rodrigo watched me from the hallway with that mix of anger and childish disappointment that irritated me so much. He asked if I was sure about what I was doing, if I was really going to abandon our home for a sick man with whom I had nothing anymore. I told him he didn't understand, that someday he would see I was doing the right thing. I closed the door without looking back. As I went down the stairs, I kept telling myself that time would put everything in its place and that later he would be grateful to have been married to someone capable of such a sacrifice. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had to make an impossible choice between two people you cared about? Leave your comment below. With Javier, the world was reduced to the hospital and his apartment. Mornings were for exams and consultations, afternoons for medications and naps, nights for fever and whispers. I learned to identify his pains by the way he furrowed his brow, to change sweat-soaked sheets at 3 in the morning, to convince him to eat even if just a few spoonfuls of soup. The doctors talked about protocols, statistics, and phases, but for me it wasn't a case. It was proof that I could still do something right. His family came and went, taking turns, but in the end it was me they called when there was an emergency. I was the one who was there when he got sick, when he felt dizzy, when he was suffocating with anxiety. Over time I stopped coming and going and moved into his apartment. I started sleeping on the sofa, and on a small bed we put in his room so I could get up quickly if he needed something. I controlled his medications, organized appointments, answered messages from friends asking how he was doing. Javier looked at me with grateful eyes, saying he didn't know what he would have done without me, that I was his guardian angel. He talked about the guilt he felt about how we had ended before, about having been immature, about not knowing how to take care of me. I didn't need him to beat himself up. It was enough for me to know that in the end he had chosen to stay with me to face the ugliest part of his life. He began to say he didn't want to leave me helpless. Between one hospitalization and another, he searched on his phone for insurance options, asked me about my debts, talked about the possibility of making me a beneficiary of some policy, of leaving me at least part of the apartment. His siblings didn't look favorably on this. I noticed it in how they looked at me when they heard him mention my name alongside the word inheritance. But Javier was stubborn in his lucid moments. He said I had left a comfortable life and a marriage to care for him, that it was the least he could do. And I, deep down, felt it was fair. In the midst of that routine of hospitals and suffering, sometimes I needed air. One night, after they adjusted his medication and he fell asleep early, a friend texted me. She told me she was nearby, to go out for a bit, but I was going to go crazy if I didn't see anything other than an 4 drip. I hesitated for 5 minutes, looked at Javier breathing deeply. I told his mother I was going out for a while and that she could stay, and I left. We arrived at a bar with loud music, low lights, and the smell of drinks mixed with cheap perfume. I ordered 1 drink, then another another, and felt for the first time in a long time that I wasn't just the caregiver of a sick person, but a woman. At some point in the night, a man approached me. He was one of those guys who know they're attractive, with an easy smile and confident hands. We talked about anything, about music, about work, about nothing important. He asked if I was alone. I answered more or less. He said I should better think only about myself for one night. The rest just flowed. We ended up in an unfamiliar bed, with heavy breathing and a mind intoxicated with exhaustion and drinks. I wasn't in love. I don't even remember his face well, but in that moment I felt I deserved a couple of hours of disconnection, of not thinking about chemotherapies or pains. When I returned to Javier's apartment at dawn, the world resumed its track as if nothing had happened. I washed my face, prepared breakfast, answered a call from the doctor. The previous night became a parenthesis that I preferred not to look at directly. I told myself that no one could judge me for seeking a break in the midst of that nightmare, that if the roles were reversed, anyone would have done something similar. I told Javier I had gone out to clear my head with a friend. He just caressed my hand and said he hoped I would also think about myself from time to time. A few weeks later, I started noticing strange things in my body: constant tiredness, morning sickness, smells that bothered me. I bought a pregnancy test almost out of inertia, more to rule it out than anything else. When I saw the 2 marked lines, I felt my heart give a strange leap. I sat on the edge of the bathtub with the strip in my hand, silently measuring possibilities. I could play dumb, I could think about dates with a calculator in hand, but in that moment what weighed most wasn't the data, but what I needed to be true. I decided the child was Javier's, not because I could prove it on a calendar, but because this child was what closed the whole story the way it had to close. It was the child we didn't have when we were young, the result of having stayed with him until the end, proof that something alive had come out of so much pain. I went into his room with the test in my pocket. I looked at him while he was lying down, pale but awake, and told him I thought I was pregnant. His eyes filled with tears. He took my hand with what little strength he had left and began to talk about hope, about how this baby was going to be the light in the midst of everything, about how we had to fight a little longer. From that moment on, everything began to revolve around that idea. I talked to his family as if the pregnancy were a done deal, as if everyone knew this child was his. His mother was cold, but she didn't deny it either. Javier, when he had good days, would caress my still flat belly and say he wanted to leave something for his child, that he wasn't going to allow him to grow up without support. The doctors, on their side, remained professional and distant. For them, the tumor continued its course, medication was adjusted, the prognosis didn't change because something else was happening in my body. The end came on a Thursday around 5 in the morning. The sound of machines in the hospital, the smell of disinfectant and sweat, the bluish light of dawn filtering through the window, everything mixed into a scene that still visits me in dreams. Javier was breathing with difficulty, squeezing my hand. He said a few words I barely understood, something about taking care of myself, about the baby, about trusting me. His mother was at the foot of the bed. A brother was talking to a doctor in the hallway. When the line on the monitor stabilized into a single long sound, I knew he was gone, but my head took time to accept it. I stayed still with his cold hand in mine, until a nurse kindly asked me to leave. In the hospital papers I appeared as a cohabiting partner and primary caregiver. No one asked me too much, they simply copied what the family already took for granted. At the wake, I was the one who sat closest to the casket, who received condolence hugs, who listened to stories from when he was healthy. Javier's family took ownership of the narrative about the child that was on the way, but they never quite included me completely. They introduced me to some as the girlfriend who came back, to others as the person who cared for him until the end. I nodded, with my belly still small, convinced that time would once again finish organizing those labels. After the burial, Javier's house filled with boxes, papers, practical decisions. His siblings began talking about selling the apartment, settling debts, closing accounts. I still lived there surrounded by memories and things that, according to them, no longer belonged to me. There were tense meetings, comments about how being married made everything complicated, insinuations that it would be best if I looked for another place. The pregnancy was advancing, my belly was growing, and with each centimeter I felt my right to be there increased, although no one else seemed to see it that way. With my son's birth, priorities changed suddenly. The first months were a mix of sleepless nights, diapers, crying, and a thick sadness that wouldn't completely go away. Javier's family visited occasionally, brought some gifts, took photos, but there was never a clear conversation about responsibilities. I started moving on my own. I sold some furniture that no one claimed. I accepted occasional jobs. I ended up renting a small room in a cheaper neighborhood when it became clear they no longer wanted me to stay in Javier's apartment. Time passed in blows. When my son turned 2, I was already exhausted. I earned little, paid a lot, adjusted accounts all the time. The room where we lived was narrow. The noise of buses came up through the window. The refrigerator was sometimes almost empty. I started looking back toward the life I had with Rodrigo. It wasn't perfect, but there was a roof of our own, guaranteed food, stability. I thought that he, being as decent as he always believed himself to be, wasn't going to be capable of leaving a woman and a child on the street, no matter how resentful he was. I convinced myself that the time had come to recover what was mine. Rodrigo had always wanted children. He talked about that before everything went downhill. In my head it made sense that after what had happened he would receive me again, even if it was for the child's sake. I started imagining scenes where I saw myself arriving at the house, him opening the door, looking at us, breaking a little inside, and accepting that destiny was pushing us to rebuild what had fallen apart. I told myself that in the end I hadn't done anything other than follow the path of my heart. One Monday at 9 in the morning, I stood in front of what had been our house with the child in my arms and 2 small suitcases. I dressed in the best clothes I had, fixed up the child a bit, combed his hair, rang the doorbell with a mix of nerves and confidence. While I waited, I looked at the facade I knew by heart, the window of our old room, the small garden I myself had helped plant. I felt that somehow I was closing a circle. Rodrigo opened the door with the face of someone not expecting anyone important. His gaze went down from my face to the child, from the suitcases to my worn shoes. I didn't see in his eyes the break I had imagined so many times, but something colder, more distant. I started talking fast, as if I could beat time. I told him Javier had died, that I had cared for him until the end, that the child needed a real home, that this was still my house. I reminded him that I had always been a present partner, that what had happened with my ex was an exceptional situation. He didn't take long to cut me off. Without raising his voice, he told me to wait, that he was coming back. He went in, left the door ajar, and after a few minutes returned with an envelope in his hand. He handed it to me without ceremony. Inside were copies of a divorce sentence, dates, signatures, stamps, divorce for unjustified abandonment of the home. It had been 2 years already. There were also papers from the sale of the house. He said he no longer lived there, that he had only gone to leave some things, that the new owners were moving in the next day, and he finished by saying I wasn't his problem, that child wasn't his, and that if I insisted on staying, he would have to call the authorities. I tried to appeal to memories. I talked to him about our dinners, about the plans we once made, about how much it had meant to me. I pointed to the child. I reminded him he had always wanted to be a father, that it made no sense for him now to refuse to give me a hand. He just looked at me with a mix of exhaustion and determination and repeated that he owed me nothing. He told me that when I left I had chosen, that I couldn't come back as if nothing had happened with another man's child and pretend that life froze waiting for me. The door closed with a soft click, but the sound echoed in my head. I stood on the sidewalk with the morning sun hitting my face, the child starting to cry, and the suitcases weighing more than they actually weighed. I looked at the house's facade one more time, knowing I had no place there anymore. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and injustice. After everything I had left, everything I had cared for and endured, no one seemed willing to recognize my sacrifice. To the world, I was just the woman who abandoned her husband for a sick ex and came back with a child no one asked for. Update 1. After that scene at the door, I knew Rodrigo wasn't going to be an option. Not because I couldn't try again, but because his reaction made it clear he had decided to erase me, arrange his life without me, and play the dignified one in the process. I sat for a while in a nearby plaza with the child in the stroller and the suitcases beside me and began to mentally review what I had and what I didn't. I had no house, no husband, no steady job. The only thing I had was the complete story of what I had done for Javier and the child, who for me was the last link to him. When I stopped to think coldly, I saw that the only place where I could still claim something was in the past I built with my ex. I began introducing myself everywhere as Javier's widow. The word came out naturally, almost automatically. No one was going to check if there were officially signed papers or not. In the neighborhood where I now rented, neighbors knew me as the girl who had left everything to care for a sick man and who now raised alone the son he left. When I ran into some of Javier's relatives on the street or at the supermarket and they referred to me as the girl who took care of him, I corrected them calmly, saying I was his partner, the mother of his child. I didn't raise my voice, didn't make scenes, just repeated what for me was a fact. One day, reviewing an old folder that had been left in a cardboard box, I found something that became my anchor. It was a draft will that Javier had once started. It wasn't complete or formally signed, but there in his handwriting appeared his intention to leave me part of the apartment and a small policy so I wouldn't be left helpless. It wasn't a perfect document, it wasn't a magic solution, but it was proof that he had thought about me beyond the hospital. Seeing my name written on that paper brought back a sense of entitlement I thought I'd lost. With that draft in hand, I went to see a neighborhood lawyer someone recommended. The office was on a second floor with peeling walls, but that didn't matter to me. I sat in front of him and told him my complete version. I told him I had left my husband to care for Javier, that I had moved in with him, that I accompanied him to his last breath, that I was pregnant when he died, and that the child was his son. I talked about the draft will, about the promises to protect me, about how the family had taken advantage of the grief to kick me out of the apartment and divide everything. The lawyer listened attentively, reviewed the papers, asked some questions. He didn't seem scandalized, rather analytical. He said the situation wasn't simple, but it wasn't impossible either. He commented that although we hadn't been married, I could try to demonstrate cohabitation, economic dependence, even the existence of a child who had been left helpless. He pointed to the draft will as an interesting element, proof of intention. He talked about deadlines, lawsuits, the possibility of claiming part of the assets and some type of compensation. I left that office with something I hadn't felt in a long time, the sensation that not everything was lost. For the first time since Javier had died, someone put into words something I had always felt, that it wasn't fair for his family to keep everything as if I had been a simple hospital companion. I started imagining what I could achieve if the trial went in my favor. I wasn't talking about luxuries, but about stability, a roof of my own, a bank account that wasn't always in the red, decent school for my son, a kind of compensation for the years I had given. When the lawyer told me he saw potential in the case and was willing to take it, I felt the world had a little order again. He explained we would have to gather evidence, photos, messages, medical reports where my presence was recorded, testimonies from neighbors and friends who knew I lived with Javier. He also mentioned the need to make it clear the child was his son as a key element to reinforce the claim. For me that wasn't a problem. I had always talked about my son as Javier's son. I saw no reason to question it. Now I decided to move forward with everything. I signed documents, authorized the lawyer to represent me, committed to getting names, papers, anything that would help. I didn't experience it as a risky move, but as an act of minimal justice. After having left a stable husband and a settled life to accompany a man in the worst stage of his existence, the least I could expect was a part of what he left. I wasn't going to allow them to reduce me to a blurry memory or a footnote in the story of his illness. If the only way to get recognition for what I did was before a judge, then that was what had to be done. Update 2. When the lawyer formally presented the inheritance claim, everything that until then had been memory and paper became a file. He asked me for contact information for Javier's family, addresses, phone numbers, anything that would serve to notify them. I gave them to him without trembling. I didn't feel I was harming them. I felt I was simply moving a piece they had refused to recognize. While signing some more papers, he explained that once they received the notification they would have time to respond, that they would probably get angry and there would be tension, but that was part of the process. I nodded. Tension was what there had been since I appeared in Javier's life, so nothing new. The reaction didn't take long to arrive. The first to call me was his mother on a number I hardly used. I didn't answer. Then voice messages started arriving from one of his brothers full of reproaches. He said I was using Javier's name, that I was taking advantage of his memory, that he never wanted to leave me anything, and that what I had to do was work and stop looking at other people's accounts. I listened to the voice messages alone in the kitchen of the rented room while my son played on the floor with an old toy car. I didn't respond immediately. I knew that if I did it hot-headedly they would use any word of mine against me. When I finally answered, I did it the way that always worked for me, calmly and remembering details they preferred to forget. I explained that no one had been with Javier as long as I had, that while they took turns for visits, I was the one who stayed at 3 in the morning changing sheets, who cleaned vomit from the floor, who signed documents when they weren't there. I told them I wasn't asking for anything that hadn't been mentioned already in his lifetime, that I just wanted what Javier had expressed to be respected. They insisted the draft will wasn't valid, that I was manipulating the situation, that I was inventing rights. I kept repeating that no one was giving me back the years I left there. I started using my social media differently. Instead of sharing random photos of my son or cheap motivational phrases, I wrote about the wear and tear of caring for someone until the end and then being erased from the story as if nothing happened. I didn't put names, but anyone who knew the case could connect the dots. I uploaded old photos of Javier, blurry or taken from angles where you could only see a hand, a silhouette, a profile. I wrote things like, "It hurts to see how blood divides everything and treats the one who was really there like a nuisance." Some friends commented that I was strong, that God saw everything, that justice came late, but it came. Others just left a heart and disappeared from the chat. At least I felt I wasn't swallowing the story alone. In the neighborhood, the narrative also adjusted to what I needed. When someone asked why I was in court, I told them Javier wanted to leave something for his son and his family had opposed out of pure meanness. I didn't go into technical details, no one asked for them. For most, the thing was simple. A woman who cared for a sick man until the end, a small child, a cold family that wanted to keep everything. No one sat down to review dates or medical reports in the middle of the corner store. Those things are for people who have time to waste. I just repeated the part that mattered, that sacrifices couldn't go without recognition. Meanwhile, my lawyer was building the case. He asked me for screenshots of messages where Javier thanked me, reports where it was recorded that I sometimes signed for him, photos of us in the apartment, even supermarket receipts that showed we lived as a couple. He talked about witnesses, about neighbors in the building who could testify they saw me come and go every day, about nurses who could remember I was always the one at the bedside. I moved as I could, knocking on doors, remembering faces, insisting they agree to speak when necessary. In my head all that wasn't just a cold procedure, it was a kind of trial also against the family's version. They always wanted to paint me as the one who messed up Javier, who distracted him, who took him away from his correct path. Now, finally, there would be a place where someone with authority would hear that I was the one who held everything together when they didn't know what to do with so much pain. It wasn't just about money, although I needed it like air. It was about putting things in the place where they should have been from the beginning. I felt that if the judge ruled in my favor, everyone would be forced to admit that I hadn't ruined my life on a whim, but for a cause that was worthwhile. Update 3. The day of the key hearing arrived faster than I would have have wanted. The courthouse was an old building with long hallways and the smell of humidity mixed with sweat. I got up very early to get the child ready, put reasonably presentable clothes on him, and prepare a little bag with toys, wipes, something to eat. I had no one to leave him with, so I took him with me. I thought maybe seeing him there, so small, so clearly in need of support, would soften a bit those who had to decide. My lawyer had asked me to stay calm, to speak only when asked, not to react to provocations. Entering the courtroom was like walking onto a stage where everyone had already decided what role I had. Javier's family was sitting together, neat, serious. The mother with a sober handkerchief, the siblings with their usual faces, as if nothing touched them directly. Their lawyer had a very thick folder full of meticulously arranged papers. Mine, on the other hand, carried a thinner folder, but with what he considered sufficient. I sat behind him with my son on my lap. The child played with a plastic car, oblivious to everything. The hearing began with formalities, full names, identity documents, reading of what was being claimed. My lawyer presented first. He talked about my cohabitation with Javier, about the years we left behind that were resumed when he was diagnosed with the illness. He said I had given up a settled life to care for a man who was terminal, that I had been his main support, that there was even a child fruit of that bond who had been left without adequate protection. He mentioned the draft will, Javier's messages, my constant presence in medical reports. I listened to him speak and nodded inside. I felt that finally someone was putting into words everything no one had wanted to look at seriously. When it was my turn to testify, I told what I had told 1,000 times, how I left Rodrigo, how I moved into Javier's apartment, how I accompanied him to every chemotherapy. I explained that the pregnancy came in the midst of all that for us it was a sign of hope, that Javier was excited about the idea of leaving something for his son. I didn't go into details that weren't relevant to the case. I limited myself to what supported the claim. Then came the turn of the family's lawyer. At first he spoke generally. He said they respected my pain, that they recognized my participation in Javier's final stage, but that didn't automatically make me an heir. Up to that point everything sounded like an expected speech, but then he started pulling out papers I had never seen. Detailed medical reports, precise dates, protocols that honestly I never cared to read with such depth when I was involved in all that. One of the documents was a report from the oncologist and another from a fertility specialist. It was stated there that due to chemotherapy and other complications, Javier had become sterile and without the ability to maintain complete intimate relations many months before the probable conception date of my child. The lawyer said it with his neutral, almost bored tone, as if he were reading the weather forecast. Then he added that, according to those same reports, there was no biological possibility that Javier was the child's father. He finished by saying I had built my claim on false paternity. I felt the blood rush to my face. I started mentally reviewing dates, months, movements. Yes, I knew Javier's body had deteriorated, that there were things that were no longer like before, that many nights he barely had strength to hold my hand, but I never stopped to cross numbers on an agenda. For me, the child was his because that's how it had to be, because that's how everything closed, because in the midst of so much chaos one thing had to make sense. Hearing someone put an impossibility stamp on that in front of everyone was like having a floor I had propped up myself ripped away. My lawyer tried to question the dates, said that bodies aren't exact machines, that reports can have margins of error, that sometimes doctors record a moment as definitive when there are still small possibilities. He even suggested the idea that although the papers spoke of sterility, exceptions could always exist. He even spoke about how a genetic analysis could clarify things, but the other side already had everything arranged. They mentioned that a DNA test had never been requested, that there was never a formal paternity declaration by Javier, that everything was based on what I said. While they argued, I felt stares fixed on the back of my neck. The judge, the assistants, even some people who were there for other cases and who had stayed to listen to the morbid curiosity of a story that mixed illness, inheritance, and a child who maybe wasn't who everyone thought. My hands burned with impotence. I wanted to say the dates could be off, that not everything can be measured with such rigidity, that there were intimate moments no one recorded on paper, but I also knew that the more I spoke the more they would use my words to shape the version that suited them best. By the end of that hearing I was no longer just a woman claiming an inheritance. I was, in their eyes, an interested party who had lied about her child's paternity, a person who had latched onto a deceased man's name to try to secure a roof. No one was seeing the sleepless nights, the sickness, the screams of pain, the hands I held in the hospital. They only saw numbers, reports, and a child who, according to their calculations, couldn't be Javier's. I left the courtroom with my son asleep on my shoulder, my heart tight, and the feeling that from one moment to the next they had decided to turn me into the villain of a story I myself had sustained with my body. Update 4. The sentence arrived a few months later, and I had already learned to live with the weight hanging over my head like a heavy cloud. I went to the courthouse with an empty stomach, more from nerves than lack of food. The judge read the ruling with the same monotonous voice with which people repeat news that doesn't affect them. He declared my claim on Javier's assets inadmissible. He said a formal union or economic dependence that justified a part of the inheritance had not been proven. He mentioned that the alleged paternity of the child had not been accredited and that in light of the medical reports there were strong doubts about the truthfulness of what I had maintained. As if that weren't enough, he added that the process had evidenced elements of bad faith on my part. According to that paper, I had exaggerated, omitted, and accommodated facts to try to obtain an economic benefit. That's why they condemned me to pay the legal costs of Javier's family. The figures weren't gigantic compared to big television trials, but for someone who counted coins for transportation and food, they were an impossible mountain to climb. The family's lawyer smiled barely, a minimal grimace, but enough to make it clear he felt he had won something more than a case. The news didn't stay within those walls. Within days, the trial summary started circulating. It didn't take a famous person to share it. Screenshots that someone sent to a group were enough, and from there they jumped to others. Suddenly, people I hadn't talked to in years knew I had lost an inheritance trial, that the judge had doubted my word, and that to top it off they had left in writing that surely the child wasn't Javier's son. The story deformed with each repetition. Some said the judge had shown I had invented everything, others that they wanted to put me in jail and had only forgiven me because of the child. In the neighborhood where I rented, the atmosphere changed. The owner of the room, who until then had remained relatively neutral, started making comments about not wanting problems on his property. He insinuated that if the press showed up in the area or if any neighbor complained, he would have to ask me to vacate. No one came with cameras, but the whispers reached. At the store they stopped greeting me the same way. Some neighbor women who used to sit and talk with me now crossed the street when they saw me coming. No one said it to my face, but you could see in their eyes they had put a label on me. Rodrigo also found out. Of course, one night, while washing some borrowed dishes in the small sink of the room, I received a message from an unknown number. It was short, cold. It thanked me for having confirmed that he had done himself a favor when I left. He didn't mention the child, didn't ask about anything. It was just a kind of closure, as if he needed that small written triumph to continue with his head held high in the life he had built without me. I didn't respond. What for? I knew in his head I was living proof of what he had always warned, that leaving with Javier was madness without return. With the label hanging over my name, getting work became even more complicated. Before, at least, I could enter houses to clean or care for elderly people and they would see me as a hurried woman, but normal. Now, every time I handed over my ID or filled out a form, I feared someone would search my name online. Cut-off comments started arriving. A lady who had offered me to care for her mother changed her mind at the last minute, saying they had finally arranged things with a niece. A couple who needed someone to clean stopped answering my messages after saying they were going to think about it. I ended up accepting jobs no one wanted, endless shifts cleaning empty offices at night, caring for elderly people who didn't even remember my name, running errands for people who treated me as if I were part of the furniture. The money barely covered rent, some food, and the child's basic expenses. The court costs remained there like a debt that would grow if I didn't pay it, but no one could take from where there wasn't anything. My lawyer, who at first showed interest in the case, now just said he was sorry, that the system was like that maybe later something could be reviewed. I nodded, tired of fighting against walls. The worst wasn't just the money, it was the feeling of having lost the right to tell my story without it being crossed with comments. Now, every time I tried to explain something, the other person already wore the idea that I was that woman who left her husband for her ex, got pregnant by someone else, and then wanted to take money from a deceased man. That phrase repeated in different ways stuck like a stain on everything. It didn't matter what I said. The summary was already made and was much easier to remember than the details of everything that happened in between. Update 5. With time things didn't improve, they just changed form. Almost 5 years have passed since Javier died, and if you look at it from the outside, my life seems like a circle that spins on itself without getting anywhere. My son is 4 years old. He's restless, curious, asks more than I sometimes have the strength to answer. When he sees other children with their fathers, he stays watching for a while and then looks at me as if searching for something I can't quite give him. Sometimes he asks about his dad when he hears others talk about theirs. I tell him his dad is in heaven, that he takes care of him from there. It's simpler to keep the story in the heights than to bring all the details down to earth. The truth is I don't know who his biological father is. That night of drinks remained blurred between loud music and the smell of drinks. I remember loose fragments, a black shirt, large hands, a shared taxi. At the time I didn't think to keep names or numbers. My head was on Javier, on the analyses, on the hospital. The rest was a parenthesis I preferred to close quickly. After the trial, when the paternity issue became a weapon against me, I tried to remember more forcefully, search for faces in old photos, discreetly ask my friend if she remembered anything more. Nothing concrete, just shadows. Paying someone to investigate was never a real option. I barely managed to maintain the rent where we are and the month's food. The jobs I've managed to keep are those no one wants, poorly paid and exhausting. I move from house to house, shift to shift, carrying with me a little bag with the child's toys in case I have to drag him somewhere. When I manage to leave him with a neighbor for a few hours, I feel as much relief as guilt. He's not to blame for anything, but he lives adapting to a broken rhythm he didn't choose. In the few free moments I have, when the child is already asleep and the neighbor's TV stops sounding, sometimes I turn on my phone and type my name in the search engine. The first thing that appears is still the trial summary. me. My name associated with words like abandonment, infidelity, unfounded claim. It doesn't matter how many nice photos I upload of my son or how many phrases I try to put about moving forward. What remains visible, what anyone sees with 2 clicks, is that frozen version of me. It's strange to feel that for people who never saw you, you exist only as a case, as an anecdote. I haven't spoken with Rodrigo again. I know from loose comments he rebuilt his life, that he moved, that he has a better job. Some say he's with someone, others that he's alone by choice. I'm not really interested in the sentimental part. What sometimes crosses my mind is that if things had been different, my son would have a firmer roof, a better school, a less tight future. But then I remember he closed the door in my face without hesitation, and the idea of imagining him as salvation passes. Everyone chose and lived with what they chose. I'm not allowed to forget that. Javier's family disappeared from the map. They don't call, don't ask, don't send even a message for birthdays. It's as if the child never existed for them, as if the part of the story that doesn't suit them could be erased with silence. Sometimes I think it was better that way, that it wasn't worth having close people who only know how to see you based on what they think you did wrong. Other times, when the child gets sick and I have to choose between taking him to a decent clinic or paying rent, I bite my tongue and wonder what everything would be like if they had accepted to help even a little. There are nights when I stay looking at the ceiling, listening to my son's soft breathing, and I review everything like a poorly edited movie. Javier's call, the argument with Rodrigo, the suitcase at the door, the hospital sheets, the pregnancy test, the wake, the doorbell of my ex-husband's house, the judge's ruling. I could try to put together a more complacent version, say I was wrong about everything, that I should have stayed still in the first life I had and not moved anything, but that would be lying to myself. At every moment I did what, according to me, made the most sense with what I felt and with what the world put in front of me. What hurts most isn't having made one decision or another, but seeing how in the end everything is reduced to labels that others repeat without thinking. For many people I'm the bad woman who left her husband for an ex and on top of that ended up pregnant by a stranger. I'm the one who wanted to take money from a deceased man, the one who was unmasked in front of a judge. No one sees the exhaustion in the bones, the sleepless hours, the sacrifices that don't appear on papers. My son, without meaning to, inherited that noise. He'll grow up hearing cut versions of something he didn't even ask to live. I keep going because there's no other option. I get up, work, take him to the park when I can, teach him to count, to say thank you, not to be afraid. Sometimes, while watching him play, I think that if something good came out of all this chain, it's him. He's not to blame for the way he came into the world or for the stories that surround him. If someday he asks more seriously, I'll have to decide how much to tell him and how much to keep stored. For now, the only thing I keep firm is the idea that although everyone wants to reduce me to a label, I know how much I left on the road. The problem is that, unlike judicial rulings and gossip, isn't written anywhere. And that's where her story ends for now. A woman who left everything for what she believed was love and duty, only to find herself labeled, judged, and abandoned by everyone. The courts didn't see her sacrifice. Her ex-husband didn't see her humanity. And Javier's family only saw a threat to their inheritance. Today she lives day by day, working exhausting jobs, raising a child whose father she doesn't even know, and carrying the weight of decisions that made sense in the moment but that the world will never forgive. Sometimes the price of following your heart is higher than anyone could imagine. And sometimes, no matter how much you sacrifice, the world will only remember the version of you that's easiest to judge.